Hello everyone, and you're all very welcome to today's client experience webinar on challenging the stigma of mental health and fostering mental wellness. This program is all about bringing you practical insights on the biggest challenges and opportunities facing in-house legal teams. And this doesn't stop at just providing support when it comes to technical topics. Today's session switches up the focus to supporting you and your team from a personal development perspective. So whether you're a general counsel or a team leader or someone that struggles in this area yourself, our hope is that today's session inspires you to reach out to others in a different way, and most critically, gives you the practical guidance on how to create an environment that fosters mental wellness on our teams and across our organisations. Never more so than today, we really want you to get the most from the next 60 minutes. As always, we'd really encourage you to get involved, sharing your perspective, comments or questions in the chat as we work through the discussion. So with that in mind, we're going to start exactly that by getting your input on 2 polls. So our first poll, which you should be able to see now on your screens, has 2 questions for you. The first question is, have you ever struggled with your mental health? And it's obviously a yes, no, or I prefer not to say. And just to reiterate that, of course, this is a confidential poll, and we will share the results with you shortly so that you can get a sense of everyone else joining us today. The second question, if you just scroll down to the bottom of your screen, is whether or not you'd feel comfortable sharing that at work. And the options are yes, yes, but it depends with whom, no, or I'd prefer not to say. It's lovely to see so many people just getting straight into it. So I'm just going to do a short countdown on this poll. Let's go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm now going to end the poll and share the results with you all. Okay, so 74% of our audience have struggled with mental health. And would you feel comfortable sharing that at work? 68% of you say yes, but it depends with whom, and an additional 23% of you say no. Okay, our panel, our fantastic panel, who you'll be meeting shortly, are just going to pick up on some of this today as we work through the discussion. So our second question for you, which you should now see on the screen, is all around confidence in engaging with your team. So our question is, do you feel confident in your ability to provide support or guidance to members of your team who may be struggling with mental health or have a mental illness? Great. So I can see participating shooting up, which is lovely to see. So thank you for jumping into these questions with us. I'm just going to do a short countdown to allow everybody to indicate. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on this one. And we are heading towards a 70% participation on this. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you shortly. So on this one, 65% of you say that it really depends on the situation. And it's really excellent to see we have a 25% on yes, I know the resources that are available. So I'm looking forward to our panel picking up on what you've just shared with us. So without further ado, I'm excited, really excited, to hand you to my colleague at Denton's, Tulsi Patel, who is our fantastic host for today's session. We hope you find it of value.
Thank you, Neve, and hi everyone. It's great to see so many people on the call, and the numbers are going up by the minute. So as Neve mentioned, my name is Tulsi Patel and I'm based in London. I'm the Inclusion, Diversity and Wellbeing Lead for Denton's here in the UK, Ireland and Middle East region. It's not a job I thought I would have. I spent the first part of my career working in the world of digital transformation with AI and robots. very exciting. But what struck me the most was the lack of real connection between colleagues, and in particular, how many of my colleagues seem to be struggling with their mental health and with mental ill health, but in silence. And actually, most of them not recognizing that that's what it was at the time, including myself. And I've now spent many years exploring that in more detail and working with organizations to create safe, inclusive, and high-performing cultures. So we're here today to challenge the stigma around mental health. You may know the statistic, but an estimated 1 in 4 people in society are struggling with their mental health at any one time. And 74% of you in the poll earlier mentioned that you had struggled with your mental health at some point in life too. And the International Bar Association found back in 2021 that 1 in 3 lawyers globally believe work has negatively impacted their mental health. And nearly half of those lawyers, 41%, would not disclose mental health concerns to their employer for fear of the potential impact on their career. So those are quite astonishing statistics, I think. And that's why it's so important for us to be having conversations around mental health, mental ill health, like the one we're having today. Only by talking and dispelling the myths and really learning more about ourselves and each other can we really create an environment and a working culture where, we really can promote well-being for all. So I'm joined today by an impressive panel of speakers who will share their personal stories and talk to some of the questions you may have on your mind, so that we can leave you with some practical tips of what you can do as a peer and as a leader to support those around you. So I'm joined by Carol Dagger, Ryan Middleton, and Joanne Wakeford. We do touch on the topic of suicide as we talk through the stories. So some of you may find that triggering. So please do just, take a moment, a pause as you need. And I think it's first most important to get into the stories, and then we'll talk to some of the questions in more detail. So Carol, if I can come to you first, would you mind introducing yourself and sharing your story with us?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tulsi. And it's a pleasure to be on this call. And thank you to Dentons for having me on the call. I love that we have 88 participants, which is great. So my name is Carol Dagger. I am based out of Toronto in Canada, and I am a lawyer by profession. I've been practicing for over 25 years. I'm called to both the New York and the Ontario Bar. I started my career out at Sherman and Sterling in New York, practicing cross-border debt and equity financings. And then I joined CIBC, a Schedule I bank in Canada, 6 years on the wealth management side and another 6 on the retail side. And then I went to Scotiabank to head up the commercial and retail legal team. And I've spent the last 5 years heading up the retail team at Loblaw, which is, as most of you will know, is Canada's biggest employer and biggest grocer. I was recently awarded with the Law Society Medal for excellence in the legal profession and for my advocacy in mental health. I am a mental health advocate for CAMH, which is Canada's largest mental health and addiction hospital. And I am married. I've got 2 girls, 10 and 14. And I have a wonderful family of 5 sisters who are my embedded best friends and my parents. So this intro sounds a bit braggy, but it's not intended to be. It's intended to show you the visible Carol that everyone sees and thinks, wow, what an amazing life she has. She's got everything going for her. And that is very true. I'm very blessed and I have a lot going for me. But I want to tell you about the invisible me to contextualize who Carol Dagger is. I have been struggling with mental illness for a very long time. My first suicide attempt was in first year university. So my mental illness was undiagnosed until 14 years ago when I had my first daughter, Madeline, and I started experiencing very severe postpartum depression. At the time, I thought that it was just that I wasn't cut out to be a mom, and that I should just stick to the law. I didn't realize that this was a diagnosis that a lot of women suffer from. Postpartum then translated over the next 14 years into treatment-resistant major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, and severe trauma disorder. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term treatment resistant, it essentially means that I have tried most, if not every single form of traditional treatment to manage and to manage my mental illness. That includes having tried antidepressants in all 5 classes of antidepressants. So I've tried 41 different antidepressants over the last 14 years. I've taken over 10,000 antidepressants. I have done psychotherapy every week for the last 14 years. I have done cognitive behavioral therapy. I have done repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a treatment where a metal contraption gets put on your head for 30 minutes at a time and it beeps. You do that about 15 to 30 times at CAMH, the mental health medical facility, with the hope of igniting the happy neurons. This treatment works for about 50% of patients. I was not one of the lucky 50. So then I had to try electroconvulsion therapy, which is a treatment where you are put under general anesthetic. Your ankles and wrists are strapped onto a bed, and a mouth guard is put onto your teeth so as not to break your teeth as you're grinding when you're having a seizure, when you're asleep. And the idea behind this treatment is, again, to ignite the happy neurons. You do this for about 15 different sessions, 3 times a week. And again, there's a 50% chance of success. When you do this treatment, some of the side effects include memory loss of biographical data and short-term memory loss. So imagine I would come home after these treatments and I wouldn't remember my kids' names. I wouldn't remember where I lived, my husband, any of that for 48 hours. Unfortunately, that treatment didn't work for me either. This is why my condition is called treatment resistant. So then I have to try innovative treatments, which include ketamine. Some of you may be familiar with ketamine as a street drug, but what a lot of people don't know is that ketamine is also an anesthetic that's been used for decades when you go to surgery and they put you under. In the right dose, it's been found to be effective for those of us who have treatment-resistant mental illness conditions. So after my last suicide attempt, which was just over 2 years ago, where I swallowed 2 bottles of pills, and saved by my husband, who happened to walk in at the right time, I then had to do ketamine. Ketamine can either be done through a nasal spray or through an IV. IV is more effective, which is what I did. It's about 8 treatments, 45 minutes each, again, under medical and psychological supervision. You go on a psychedelic trip. It's essentially therapy on steroids. Again, a lot of severe memory impact. Once you do the treatment for 48 hours afterwards, you're on severe suicide watch, and you cannot be left alone. After I finished this treatment, it actually worked and I became non-episodic. But it doesn't mean I'm cured, because there's no cure for mental illness, unfortunately. So I am prone to have episodes for the rest of my life. My condition is chronic. And when I do, I resort to my toolkit, which I'm on every day for the rest of my life. And that includes medication. It includes therapy, exercise, mindfulness, journaling, and trying to cut out sugar, which I'm terrible at. So I consider myself a highly functioning, mentally ill person. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Tulsi.
Thank you, Carol, and yeah, thank you for sharing your story with us. The way you describe the visible Carol versus, behind the scenes that people won't see. I think will resonate with many people because we all have, the outside and then the inside. But, I appreciate your honesty and candidness in sharing just how difficult it has been. And I'm really pleased to hear that after trying lots of things that you found something that is working for you. And you mentioned at the end the importance of building your toolkit so you have different ways of looking after yourself and managing your mental illness. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Ryan, perhaps I can pass to you to tell us your story.
Absolutely. So good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Middleton, and I'm a partner and the National Banking Group Leader for Dentons Canada. And I've been practicing law for more than 22 years, and my entire career has been in the private practice space. My journey with mental illness started in my late 20s while at law school when I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. And prior to law school and throughout my life, I was someone that was laser focused at being the best at everything I did, whether it's sports, academics, career. I looked at life in two categories. There was winners and there's losers, and I wanted to win at everything. Because of my drive to succeed, I pushed myself really hard and in a very unhealthy way. I was constantly scanning myself for weaknesses, and I believed that I could overcome anything that life threw at me just with sheer hard work. If those around me, including my mother, who struggled with alcoholism, had depression, anxiety, or some type of addiction, the old Ryan, the younger Ryan believed that they could outwork these struggles, and the failure to do so is a sign of them not working hard enough. Suffice to say, my views towards mental illness and addiction was extremely ignorant. Extrinsically, my hard driving and unforgiving lifestyle served me well from the outside. For most of my early adulthood, I excelled at sports, school, my initial career in international business before returning to law school at the age of 26. And upon arriving in law school, I quickly realized that I was surrounded by some of the smartest and most successful people I've ever been around. And I immediately felt like an imposter. I doubted that I deserved to be amongst this cohort of really impressive people. And in response to that self-doubt, I put my head down and worked extremely hard to prove that I belonged. Um, I would study day and night, but with the assistance of caffeine pills and sleeping pills. I lived in the law library, and I was really focused on trying to lead my law class in grades. And eventually, not surprisingly, that this unhealthy pace caught up to my body and my mind, and I started to experience panic attacks. Um, these panic attacks led to fear of going to school, driving, being around my peers. And the panic attacks led to constant anxiety. I could never relax. I felt like I was about to run a 100-meter race 24/7. I could not sleep. I lost my appetite. It was at this point I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. So 22 years ago, there was really very little discussion around mental illness, especially in the legal profession. And upon being diagnosed with general anxiety disorder, I went onto Google, and it did exist back then, and tried to figure out what I needed to do to what I thought it was outworking my problem. At no point at this point in my life did I think I had an illness. I began to meditate twice a day. I journaled every day. I gave up caffeine, alcohol, and sugar, lost about 25 pounds. I went to yoga 5 times a week. I went to a therapist once a week. I jogged every day. I had honestly never worked so hard in my life to overcome something. And it was because I felt like I was fighting for my life. No matter how hard I worked, unfortunately, I was getting worse and worse to the point that I was afraid to leave my house or to speak to anyone out of fear that they would think I was crazy. This went on for more than 8 months. And at my lowest point, I thought my life was over, my legal career was over, and I was destined to be a homeless person living on the streets. I mean, that's really where my head was at that point. Um, and I didn't want to live like this anymore. My therapist suggested I try medication. And at first, I was strongly against it, as I believed that it was going to change me as a person. However, I was desperate to get better, and I agreed. And within 10 to 14 days of taking the medication, and I was lucky, the medication really started to help me. I started to sleep. I got my appetite back. I began to began to leave the house again. And I began seeing a psychotherapist who specialized in anxiety. And between medication and therapy, I was able to get back to, my normal self. Over the next 22 years, and take me to the present, I continued to experience ups and downs with my anxiety disorder. However, through a lot of hard work, medication, therapy, and other parts of my toolkit, I've been able to control this anxiety and lead a very rewarding and successful life. And for 22 years, I kept my illness a secret. I was afraid to let others know out of fear that they would view me as weak as a person, weak as a lawyer, weak as a leader. A few years ago, I finally decided to tell my story, and people asked me, well, why the change of heart? And really it came down to during COVID, I was shocked to see how many people that I was close to within my team, within my organization, around me were suffering from some type of mental illness or addiction. In some cases, the situation became life and death. In many of these instances, I could see when I talked to these individuals, they were suffering in silence and were afraid to come forward to let people know they were suffering. And if they were not coming forward, they were not getting the help they needed. I hope that really as a leader within my law firm, I could tell my story, and by doing so would help reduce the stigma associated with mental illness and encourage others to take that first step towards getting help. And as soon as I publicly told my story, I was amazed by how many people contacted me to tell me their story. Many junior lawyers, law clerks, legal assistants, some of whom I've never met or have never spoken to, reached out to tell me how my story helped them to seek help. And I continue to tell my story and advocate for change in the hope that such change will help save lives and encourage and give people the necessary comfort to get the help they need. And that's my story.
Thank you, Ryan. I think there'll be a lot of people listening and reflecting on what you said, particularly at the start around pushing yourself hard and convincing yourself that you can outwork your problem. And like Carol, you talked about the importance of finding through trial and error the things that work for you, especially medication, which I think, a lot of people have misconceptions about. And perhaps most poignantly, I guess one of the reasons we're here today is the power that comes from sharing your story and the impact that that can have on others. And, to help them share what they're going through too, sometimes for the first time. Which brings me really nicely to our final speaker, Joanne. So Joanne, if I could please pass to you.
Thank you, Chelsea. Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Wakeford, and I'm Chief Client Officer for Denton's In-House Solutions. I have the pleasure of working with law departments all around the world and looking at how they can become more efficient and effective as a team. And I've had the pleasure of presenting a few times now on our client experience webinar program on things like personal branding, change management, and strategic planning for the law department. But today I'm coming to you with a bit of a different message, and I wanted to share my story and experiences with mental illness and my journey with mental health. I'll ask that you bear with me, please. This is only the second time now I've spoken publicly about all of this, the first being about 13 hours ago. Actually, it was a video recording that both Carol and Ryan did about 2 years ago, where they talked about their own challenges. And I had the fortune of having a colleague share it with me. And it allowed me to realize that if they can talk about the challenges in their life, it's obviously okay for me to talk about it as well. So a huge thanks again to you, Ryan and Carol, for being so brave and for both being a leader for mental health advocacy. So about a year ago, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder and generalized anxiety and depression. The term OCD can be used conversationally to describe someone who might be a bit of a perfectionist or like things a certain way. I cringe a bit when I hear that because it's not a quirk, it's an illness, and it can be very difficult. For me, it presents itself through my thoughts. I ruminate, I overthink, I catastrophize, and quite often those thoughts can be completely irrational, but can sometimes paralyze me from doing anything or making a decision, especially if I fall into a loop. But I had been struggling undiagnosed for some time until I had a mental health crisis late last summer. I completely lost executive function and was entirely consumed by this overwhelming anxiety.
You got
My
this,
husband,
Joanne.
yeah, thanks, Carol.
You got it.
Second time's more difficult, strangely. My husband, who had lost his mother, with dementia was a huge support for me. We're going to talk a little bit about the support in our lives, but he was quite terrified because the look of fear in my eyes was very similar to the fear in her eyes when she was hallucinating. It was an awful experience. And I wouldn't say that I asked for help. I didn't, because like Ryan expressed, I believe that, asking for help was a sign of weakness. I was so fortunate that I would say help came to me in a number of ways, but one person in particular, a leader in the firm, approached me and asked how I was really doing. And of course, I was very good at covering up. I'm very good at pretending. So I was not entirely clear. They explained that it's okay to not be okay. And they shared a little bit about their experiences with mental health. And I felt this immediate sense of relief, knowing that this person who I admire and respect immensely and who is incredibly successful in their career, if this person can take a step back to seek the help they need, then I could probably do it as well. So I took a short-term leave and have sought help by way of cognitive behavioral therapy. I learned a great deal about myself and what my triggers are, and how to try to stop those negative thoughts. And Carol shared some more tips before we jumped on the call today. But I am still on my journey, and I won't lie, I have regressed recently and sometimes let those old habits creep back in. But at least I am very aware of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And I can seek the support when I need it. And I have the toolkit that I have. I'm also aware that when my OCD is attuned in to the right amount and not too high, it can become a bit of a superpower, because that overthinking can sometimes enable me to catch things that others might miss. So if I could have done it differently, I would probably have sought help sooner. But when I heard that we were going to be doing a panel on this topic, and again, coming to you from a different perspective, I usually speak on this program on other substantive things, I didn't hesitate to ask to be considered to join the panel. I suppose there's a chance that someone might watch this and consider, think of me differently. But if there's just one person in this group that hears my story and maybe can relate to it just a little bit and realize that it's okay for them to talk about their challenges too, just as Ryan and Carol did for me in the recording from 2 years ago, then it's all worth it. So thank you to everyone joining today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Joanne. Very courageous of you to share your story with us on this webinar and also 13 hours ago. And I'm so glad that you did for yourself and also for us, because you've just shown us how to do it. That is courageous leadership in action, and you are the leader that you describe in your own story for others. There are some lovely comments in the chat coming your way at the moment as well. So that chain will continue as each of us share. So thank you again, Joanne. So far we've talked a bit about mental health, and we've also talked mental illness, but do we really understand what those words mean? Carol, if I can come to you, would you mind explaining to us what is mental health versus mental illness? What's the difference between the two?
Thanks, Dulcie. Joanne, I know the second time is a bit harder. It's a bit more real to talk about it, but again, I'm really proud of you. And I know you're going to have a bit of fatigue after, but we got you if you want to have a little debrief after. Thanks for sharing again.
Thank you, Carol.
So I'm very particular in talking about my condition as a mental illness, even though those two words are quite stigmatized in our society, and a lot of people, including those who suffer from mental illness, shy away from using the words. To me, there's a really big difference between mental health and mental illness. Everyone on the call has mental health and physical health, but not everyone on the call has a physical disability or a mental illness. These are very distinct terms. So mental health can be impacted negatively on a daily basis from regular, ordinary day stressors, including a lot of work on our plate, kids to look after, spouses to take care of, parents to look after, being overworked, not enough vacation, not enough time off. And those stressors are important and worthy of consideration and management. But that's not what today's conversation is about. Today's conversation is about mental illness. And that is a diagnosed condition although in Canada, you can go for a long time without being diagnosed given the wait list. But nonetheless, whether diagnosed or not, mental illness is a condition that's quite debilitating at times, and it prevents you from being able to function on a day-to-day basis in an ordinary way that other people can. They are conditions which include schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, OCD, depression, anxiety, traumatic disorder. That's what we're talking about today. And I think those of us who confuse the two terms do a lot of injustice for those that are actually suffering with mental illness, because when we equate the two, it undermines the conditions of those who are suffering to the point where they feel misunderstood and not seen or heard. As well, I think the type of accommodation that's required for the two categories is quite different. If someone is stressed, but they don't have a mental illness, the way we accommodate them is to potentially reduce their workload or reallocate them on a particular file or make sure they're taking a vacation. But the way you accommodate someone who has a mental illness would require a bit more sensitivity, a one-on-one conversation in terms of whether they need to work more from home, for example, what kind of accommodation they need. And a one-size-fits-all is not the answer for those who are suffering. By way of example, because I'm considered, and I consider myself a highly functioning lawyer, if the accommodation for me was to impose a lesser workload, that would actually be detrimental to my mental illness, because I would feel like I'm not good enough to practice. Whereas if my workload remained the same, but I could get an accommodation which may include working from home an additional day, that would do the trick for me. So the point is, the accommodation for those with mental illness has to be customized for the particular person. And the last thing I'll say about the difference between mental health and mental illness is that just like being off on workers' compensation, there's a lot of misconception that everyone who goes on short-term or long-term disability as a result of mental illness is gaming the system, that really they're just overstressed or aren't able to cut it as a lawyer. That's the minority, it's not the majority, which is why it's important, again, to distinguish between mental health and mental illness, and to understand that those who go on a mental illness leave aren't doing it to game the system. It's not an easy thing to do to take advantage of those benefits. So I'm going to pause there and turn it back over to you, Tulsi.
Thank you, Carol. That was a really clear and helpful explanation. And I think, on an individual level, many people won't realize that actually what they are experiencing is mental illness. And as you say, for leaders, knowing the difference will help them make the appropriate accommodations. So thank you for that. Ryan, I'm going to come back to you now. When you told your story to us earlier, you talked about the pressures that we put on ourselves. There are a lot of type A personalities in the legal profession. We're competitive, ambitious, driven, and the profession expects us to be resilient and perfect and not make mistakes. And there is a mindset that when things get tough, personally, work-wise, or the combination of the two, we should just keep going. We'll be fine. And we don't talk honestly about how we're feeling. So why do you think that there is still a stigma around talking about mental health in our profession? And why is it so important that we eliminate it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, something that I'm still seeing on a daily basis. And I think it all really comes down to the fact that, when you think about the history of law, you've seen a situation where people are really expecting lawyers to be these gladiators, to be perfect, never really to show any type of weakness whatsoever. You think about a lawyer, you think that you want to have a strong lawyer that's going to be able to protect you and take care of your needs. And that's really sort of continued to this day. And that also has created a situation where you're attracting a certain type of individual into this profession. So when you sort of combine the history or the perception of what you need to have as a lawyer with the legal profession, combined with these high, hardworking overachievers. You really get to a situation where you have this unhealthy dynamic where, people think that they have to work even if it's going to be to the detriment of breaking down their body. And this results in many lawyers who may be suffering from mental illness to falsely believe they're the only ones suffering because nobody wants to talk about it. I find a lot of times lawyers will look around, and because the people they're surrounded by are conveying a perceived or they're conveying their strength, you have lawyers thinking that they're the only ones that are thinking or feeling these things. And so they are often going to be quiet to actually tell people what they're dealing with. Because of this unhealthy dynamic, many people suffer in silence, and even more people leave the legal profession, especially in private practice. I mean, the turnover ratio is massive in the legal world. But the good news is over the last 10 years, there really has been a dramatic shift in what I'm seeing in the profession. The first area that's really causing this is the younger generation. They will no longer accept a work environment that does not support their mental health, irrespective of how much money they can make. That's been an absolute game changer. Older generations, it was something where, people would say, you have to, we need you to do this. We would do without question, irrespective of what that would be causing to our underlying health. But that's changed now with this younger generation. They are prioritizing their health over their job in many situations, which is the right thing to do. Secondly, organizations are now understanding the prevalence of mental illness. As more people are coming out to share their story, organizations are realizing how many people within their teams are suffering with mental illness and the short and long-term consequences to businesses if they don't properly support their people. The third is organizations are starting to view mental illness as a physical illness, just like other medical illnesses. And because of this, organizations are getting better at offering infrastructure, better resources to help people who may be suffering. Previously used to be situations where people would be dealing with mental illness and there'd be a lot of whispers, a lot of conversations behind closed doors, and organizations are not really equipped to deal with some of these situations. They've taken great steps to get better at this. Now, if organizations want to attract the brightest and best people in the legal industry, they need to provide an environment that supports its people who may be experiencing any type of medical illness, including mental illness. It's a huge competitive advantage. The legal profession, in my mind, is still an arms race. The organization with the best lawyers will be successful. But in order to attract, and this is the part that I think organizations have to get better at, it's not just attracting the best people, but it's retaining the best lawyers and legal professionals. They need to make sure they're supporting those people on an ongoing basis, because people who have mental illness now comprise a material percentage of most legal organizations.
Thank you, Ryan. And I think your point about the generational differences is interesting because we hear more and more around the tensions between kind of the new generation coming into work and, comments around work ethic and attitude. But actually, I think some of that is just them articulating what many of us feel, but never felt able to advocate for. So thank you. Right, Carol, I'm going to come back to you. You are the co-author of a recently published book called The Right Not to Remain Silent, which is a collection of personal stories from lawyers, judges, law professors who share their experiences of mental health challenges. You've written a chapter of your own experience in the book, as has Ryan, and provide guidance for those who want to support those who are struggling with mental health and mental illness. So I want to ask you first, how can we identify when someone around us might be struggling? And then secondly, what are the recommended do's and don'ts that you speak about in your book?
Thanks, Tulsi. Your very own Ryan Middleton also has a chapter in the book, which Denton should be very proud of as a white senior partner male. It's pretty amazing that he is speaking openly about mental illness. Often mental illness is considered a women's issue, but Ryan is a real trailblazer in this regard. So kudos to you. So it's actually not rocket science to figure out if someone's struggling. we all walk around every day interacting with people, and we often have superficial conversations. How was your weekend? Where are you going on vacation? We don't take the time to actually have authentic, deep conversations, which actually don't have to be time consuming. They could be as short as the superficial conversations that we have. It's really about noticing when someone is acting different than their usual demeanor. So I'm someone who shows up well groomed to work. I'm dressed fashionably. I'm usually chipper. I'm engaged with people. I'm an extrovert. So that is my natural disposition. So if you start to notice that I'm showing up to work not well dressed, staying in the office with the door closed, not interacting with people, it's probably something you should talk to me about. You should come up to me and say something like, Carol, I've known you for a long time, and you're not acting like yourself lately. And you don't have to tell me why, but I just want you to know I noticed and I care. And if there is something that's going on, or if you're struggling, I want you to know that I'm here. And I would love to listen, go for a walk, or grab a tea to just check in. And I'm going to do that on a daily basis, not just once and done, because I want Carol to understand that I notice and I care. It's as simple as that. It's caring enough and being intuitive enough to notice when people are not acting like themselves. During COVID, if for example, someone always had their camera on and all of a sudden their camera's off, or even today their camera's off, then you have to wonder why, and take the time to give a call and say, are you okay? Your camera's off. The person doesn't have to engage in a response. They don't have to disclose to you, and they might not, depending on the relationship that you have. But rest assured that they have heard that you care, and it will make a meaningful difference in their life, because they'll feel like they're in an environment where people notice and they care about their well-being. The alternative is you notice that I'm acting very different than my usual demeanor, and you go about your day, and the only interaction you have with me is about the files I'm expected to work on or produce. How's that going to make me feel? It's going to make me feel like a robot, as Ryan was saying, a gladiator that's a billable hour, or that's only intended to produce. I'm not one-dimensional, I'm multidimensional. And the sooner that companies understand that people are multidimensional and not just there to produce, the more helpful it is. So to go to your second part of the question, Tulsi, is how do you support people who are struggling? What do you do, and what should you avoid doing? So I alluded to what you should do, which is simply care enough to ask how they're doing. And then ask them what they need. Don't presume they need something. Ask them. They may not know, but they'll think about it and they'll come back to you. You don't have to be a therapist for those people. They don't need a therapist. They likely have a therapist, and if they don't, they should get one. But what you want to do is provide a non-judgmental, non-decision-making environment for them to vent, to feel heard, and to feel seen. They don't need you to solve their issues. In fact, their issues are not solvable via conversation with you, because if it was, it would have been solved a long time ago. They just need to feel like people care. The things you should absolutely not do, and things that well-meaning people did for me and continue to do for me, which is actually very hurtful and undermines my condition. So here it is, take notes. Don't tell me to be grateful for what I have. I know what I have is a blessing. If I could be grateful out of my mental illness, I would have been mentally healthy a long time ago. Don't tell me to pray, because praying is going to cure me. It's not going to cure me. My parents have given me a rosary, a Bible, oil from St. Rita and Cascia in Italy, you name it. It's all at my night table. Guess what? I'm still not cured. I'm not going to juice my way out of being mentally ill. So the celery juice recommendations, maybe don't mention them. They're not going to work. My microbiome in my gut is maybe problematic, but drinking celery juice is not going to cure my mental illness. And journaling about the things I'm grateful for is also not going to cure my mental illness. So those are things you absolutely should avoid at all costs saying to anyone who is struggling. Because if you do, it will further alienate the people who are struggling, and you can feel pretty confident they're not going to come back and talk to you about things. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Tulsi is, when you know someone is struggling, the conversation is not one and done. And I alluded to that earlier, but I just want to be clear. It's something you should do on a constant basis. Check in with Joanne. You work with her. She's now told you she suffers from OCD. Don't treat her like a pariah. Don't make her regret that she disclosed this, because people who disclose often feel like others walk around eggshells around them because they don't want to say the wrong thing to trigger their OCD or anxiety or depression. I can assure you that Joanne, Ryan, and I will be more offended if you alienate us, and will feel the love and care if you don't. So come in, check in on Joanne, ask her if she wants to go for a walk, ask her how she's coping. Don't say, how are you? Say, Joanne, how are you coping today? How are you really coping? I know it was a lot for you to talk about your OCD the other day. What can I do to help? And ask her regularly. So I'm going to pause and turn it back to Tulsi.
Thank you, Carol. As always, you make some very brilliant points there. And often, the hardest thing to do at the start is just knowing what to say. And we get stuck in our own awkwardness about that. So you've shared some very practical things there that I hope everyone listening can take away. And the main thing being just show that you care and ask questions and make time and show up for those individuals. I've got 3 more questions I'd like to ask our panel. So for our next couple of questions, if we could keep to a couple of minutes so we can get through all of them. Joanne, I'm going to come to you next. The reality is that mental illness doesn't restrict itself to people of certain backgrounds or job titles or seniority. I know the majority of people we will have on the call today will be lawyers, but our teams include people from many different professional backgrounds. So why is it so important that we think about well-being, holistically, about the team and fostering mental well-being for all?
Thank you, Tulsi. And I have to say, first of all, thank you to everyone for commenting in the chat. Your lovely comments are great to read. My phone is also blowing up with support. So Carol, people do care, and it's great to see. So thank you, everyone. When I think about sort of looking at, supporting our team's mental wellness from a holistic perspective, I think it's actually pretty simple. If you think that lawyers are experiencing, mental health issues or mental illness, it stands to reason that those working in that environment are subject to the same pressures. So in your law department, I'm talking about all of the administrative professionals, the paralegals, the legal operations professionals, all of those who are very important members of the team. They work closely with your lawyers and are often driven to the same level of performance. The standards of perfection, they're stuck to the same difficult timelines, which can often negatively impact their mental health. There's also a good chance that with 1 in 4 people suffering from mental health challenges, that these team members have their own diagnoses as well. So that's an important element to consider when you look at your team. There's also the knock-on effect that comes with working with others who may have poor mental health or mental illness, which can obviously have a serious negative impact across the team. So this can manifest itself in a number of different ways. I know I personally am very mindful of the way I interact with those around me, because I know that my OCD can sometimes mean that I micromanage details. I may seem a bit controlling at times. Sometimes, the false deadlines might be created, or you might find that there are members of the team that, maybe are unintentionally curt or dismissive in their communications. So it's all about being aware that those on your team who may struggle with mental health or mental illness may have an impact on the broader environment unintentionally. So as law department leaders, this is about making sure you approach your journey as mental health advocate with your team in the broadest of terms. And that means, not approaching any mental health programs in a bifurcated way. For example, one approach for lawyers and another approach for other professionals. And really, this is about making sure resources are available to everyone. Kelsey, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Joanne. As you say, we need to, see people as human beings, regardless of the jobs that they have, and because we're all, experiencing something. So thank you. Ryan, I'm going to come to you now. So just on the kind of practical steps that our audience can take away, what things can our leaders do to break down the stigma around mental health and to create an environment and culture that fosters mental wellness?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think leaders first need to break down this notion that legal professionals are expected to be machines without weakness. If you're constantly embracing this notion, people will be reluctant to show their true human vulnerabilities. And some of the ways you can do that to break down this this notion is that leaders can start sharing some of their own vulnerabilities. There's been many instances where I'm dealing with people within my own organization, and I'll talk to them and I'll say to an articling student or to an associate or even sometimes to a fellow partner, how are you doing? How are you really doing? Because often when you ask people, it's going to be very high level. Oh, I'm doing great, working on some really challenging files. This is fantastic. But you see they're working, crazy hours without vacation under really punishing timelines. And as soon as you start letting people know, well, when I was in those situations, these are some of the things that I really struggled with. It really sort of opens up the door for people to see that when you're showing them how you have struggled in the same situations, it's okay for them to go past the company line and actually tell you how they're really feeling. So I think that's really important. I think the second thing is leaders need to demonstrate their commitment to supporting their teams with respect to who's dealing with or struggling with mental illness. And it's about openly talking about the facts around mental illness and legal profession. It's not something that, once again, we should be discussing behind closed doors or whispers. This is a fact of the profession right now, and how do we sort of deal with it and make it an open conversation? That doesn't mean we have to push people to tell their story if they're not comfortable doing so or disclosing any confidential information. But just it should not be a taboo subject. It should be something that we talk about very openly. Third things, leaders, and this is really important, we have to look for opportunities to create a work environment that encourages self-care, recharge, and avoiding burnout. The most important asset that we have as an organization is our people. We need to find ways to encourage and allow people to take care of themselves in the short term and in the long term. If we just focus on the billable hour or just trying to get out as many projects as possible, it can have devastating consequences due to low morale, high turnover, increased recruitment costs, and unhappy clients. And I really think that too many legal organizations are only focusing on the short term billable hour or certain quantitative numbers, but fail to look at the real cost of having an unhealthy work environment. Some people say, well, Ryan, listen, how do you do that? You got demanding clients. There's no way that you can create sort of a system that can still sort of protect people. And the reality is, yes, you can. Other organizations outside of the legal profession do it. And I believe that we can do that as well. We need to change the narrative. Supporting mental health is not only important from a humanistic perspective, but from a business perspective, because in my view, a healthy organization will be a happy organization, but it will also be a profitable organization as well.
Thank you, Ryan. And I think that point you make at the end around, other professions are doing this who have similar demands. Every job is different, but we're not the only profession that has a client facing, and there are ways for us to get a better balance with that. So, on to our final question. There is a final element that we haven't discussed, which is the role of being someone who cares for someone who might be struggling with their mental health or has a mental illness. And Carol, if I can just bring you in here, perhaps you could share some advice or some guidance for leaders who are supporting someone in their team who is in that caregiver role.
I think that's often an area that's forgotten. is people who are mentally ill are generally part of some sort of a family unit, and someone has to look after that person. And those caregivers are usually neglected or considered not to have any issues that need to be accommodated. So, you know, I've been married for a long time, and my husband has been my caregiver for 14 years. And as a result, he struggles as well, because it's a really big task to look after me when I'm having very chronic episodes of depression, which include suicidal ideation. And when that happens, it is his full-time job to essentially monitor me so that I don't hurt myself. And then he's expected to go to work and resume his professional responsibilities as though nothing's going on at home. But a lot is going on at home. And when people interact with him, it's hard for him to then communicate that he is struggling, because he's not mentally ill, but he's caring for someone who's mentally ill. Now, there's a lot of people like him in the world who are looking after kids, parents, siblings, and so on, that often get forgotten. So I think it's really, really important for firms and companies to acknowledge that not only do they need to accommodate and create a safe environment for those who are struggling with mental illness, but they also have to be very cognizant that there are employees in their organizations who are caregivers that also need to be accommodated. So, for example, when I was doing my ketamine treatments, I needed to be watched for 48 hours. And my husband had to be there to watch me, because otherwise I'm at risk. And so he should be very able to tell his employer that he needs to take 2 days off to look after his spouse. And that should not be an issue or a concern for an organization. And if it is, we need to reassess that. I also think that caregivers take a really big emotional hit when they're looking after loved ones. And so I really think that those individuals need to have therapy of their own in order to be able to provide the kind of support that they need to help their loved one. So I hope that that's clear for everybody. So be kind to your colleagues, even if they're not struggling, they may be a caregiver.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you for sharing your personal experience with your husband. He's obviously been a great support to you, and as you say, it's important that he has the support he needs as well. Well, unfortunately, we are at time. I feel like we could have talked for many more hours, but it's unfortunately time to wrap up the webinar for today. And I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Carol, Ryan and Joanne, for courageously sharing their stories and showing us how that can be done, and reminding us of the influence we can have as leaders on our teams if we open up the conversations, and maybe we'll be having conversations we've just never had before. And there's a knock-on impact to kind of everyone that then touches. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you to you in our audience as well for taking the time to be here. We hope that you found this interesting and helpful. And I'm now going to quickly pass to Niamh, who will say the final few words.
Thank you, Chelsea. A huge thank you to every single one of you who dialed in and spent the last 60 minutes with us. I want to say a massive thank you for the courage, candour, passion and care our speakers have brought to today's panel and in sharing their stories. My only ask is to please drop your thoughts and your appreciation in the chat as you drop off today. We're looking forward to seeing you back online at lots of great sessions over the next number of months. That concludes our session for today. Thank you.